Greetings and welcome to Unit 3, the Texas Legislature. Have you ever wondered how Texas makes laws? Well, in this lecture, we're going to discuss the structure of the Texas Legislature, explain how Texas congressional districts are created, describe the qualifications to become a member of the Texas Legislature, and explain how a bill becomes law here in Texas. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive right into this. So you may recall from the previous lecture that Article 3 establishes the Texas Legislature within the Texas Constitution. So we have what's known as a bicameral legislature. That's right, we have a House and we have a Senate, two chambers within the one body known as the Texas Legislature. So the Texas Senate is composed of 31 senators compared to the Texas House, which has 150 members. So all in all, we have 181 members within the Texas Legislature. Now, something I like to talk about at this point, right? 31 senators compared to 150 members of the Texas House. You can imagine getting 31 people to agree on something politically related might be just a tad easier compared to 150 within the Texas House. So you may see that the Texas Senate may operate faster, may pass things faster, because you only have 31 people to deal with compared to 150 within the Texas House. I don't know, it's just a small observation here, but 31 people seems more manageable compared to 150. Just a small observation. Note that the Texas Constitution mandates that these legislative districts are single-member districts. That is to say that within the House districts, within the Senate districts here in Texas for the Texas Legislature, that they're single-member districts. That is to say that one person is elected among the people to represent that particular district within the Texas Legislature. We have what's known as a biennial sessions, meaning that the Texas Legislature, they meet once every 2 years for 140 days. That's right. Our Texas Legislature meets every 2 years for 140 days. Which that means that they meet in the odd number years, right? So we can if we were to count, right, 2023, that's odd number. They were in session. If in 2024, that's an even number, so they're not. In 2025, they will be. 2026 is even, they won't, but 2027 they will, etc., etc., etc. So which is one characteristic of our legislature that makes Texas politics kind of unique, because our legislature, they have to think ahead 2 years. Let's move on. Governor has the power to call a special session of the legislature. So let's say that the Texas Legislature didn't get through all of the agenda that the governor had. Or let's say that the Texas Legislature got done with its business, but the governor wanted them to address a particular issue. Well, the governor can call the Texas Legislature back for what's known as a special session. And this is where the governor can actually guide, or should I say, require establish what that topic is. He can actually call him back to session to deal with one very specific issue. Now, of course, it's up to the Texas Legislature to pass a law that deals with that issue, right? But the governor, he or she can actually set that agenda for them in that special session. Now let's move on. So, presiding officers, right? So within our legislature, right? The Texas House, we'll get to the Speaker of the House. The Texas Senate is presided over by the Lieutenant Governor. It is the lieutenant governor has, even though they're elected into a position within the executive branch, the Texas Constitution grants the lieutenant governor the powers to preside over the Texas Senate. What does that all entail? That's an excellent question. They get to control, rather, who is on committee, what bills get sent to what committee. They are basically the head. They are the controlling head of the Texas Senate. Now, of course, you may recall that the lieutenant governor is independently elected, i.e. they are elected separate from the governor, right? Remember we talked about that diffused, fragmented executive branch, or that plural executive branch. In the Texas House, on the other hand, this is where we have the Texas Speaker of the House. This is where the Speaker is elected actually by the members of the Texas House. So you and I don't have a direct say here on who the Speaker of the House is. But indirectly we do, right? Because we get to choose who our representatives are, right? We get to elect them. So if there's a specific speaker we want to have as a Speaker of the House here in the Texas House of Representatives, we can go up to potential candidates and be like, who are you going to support? Well, if you're not going to support who I want, then I'm not going to vote for you. I'm going to vote for your opponent, right? So indirectly we do. But how is the Texas Speaker chosen? It's done in-house. Pun very much intended here. That the Texas Speaker is chosen by the House members, right? It's done in-house, see? Pun. Yeah. It is argued here in Texas that the two most powerful political figures in Texas politics is the Lieutenant Governor and the Texas Speaker of the House. The Texas Speaker of the House has the nearly identical control like the Lieutenant Governor has in the Senate, but this time in the Texas House. The Texas Speaker of the House gets to control who's on committee, what bills get sent to committee. So very powerful positions here. And like I said, it's argued that these two are the two powerful figures in Texas politics. Not the governor, but the lieutenant governor and the Texas Speaker of the House. I'm digressing. Let's move on. So reapportionment. So the U.S. Census is conducted every 10 years. And this date is delivered, and the data is delivered to the Texas Legislature. So, census. Every 10 years, the U.S. conducts census. We collect census data. In other words, how much population lives in a particular state. And to say, in particular districts, all the districts. We need to measure, because we need to know who lives where for representation purposes. For example, if Texas got way more population compared to other states, then we deserve more representation within the U.S. House of Representatives. If California, for example, got more population, they deserve more representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. Right? So we use this data as well in the Texas Legislature to be able to determine how much representation we get in the Texas House. Right? The Texas Legislature draws a new state congressional map to maintain proportional representation, which must be done during the first regular session after the census has been conducted. Remember, our legislature meets every 2 years, an odd number of years. So whenever the census is conducted at the 10-year mark, whenever the next session is, they have to redraw our congressional district, our state congressional district lines. So the Legislative Redistricting Board takes over if the legislature fails to enact a new map, which consists of lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, the attorney general, the comptroller, and the commissioner of the general land office. Again, notice the power players here, the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House, along with some other members of the Texas executive branch, but not the governor. Let's move on. So, qualifications to become a Texas senator. To serve in the Texas Senate here in the Texas Legislature, you need to be a U.S. citizen, 5 years you need to live in Texas for 5 years as a resident, 12 months as a resident within that district, and at least 26 years old, and they serve 4 terms with no term limits. That's right. You can essentially become a member of the Texas Senate as a member, and you can keep getting reelected until you decide to quit or you pass away. So there are no term limits. So let me ask you, I'm loaded with questions, so I got one for you. What do you think about term limits? Should our members be term limited, or do you think that's more democratic? Because there are 2 arguments here, right? One argument says that we need to have a higher turnover rate. The other one says, well, if the people keep wanting the same person to represent us, isn't it more democratic, i.e. it's more representation to keep choosing the person I want, even though they've served for the last 10, 15 years. Right? Let me know what you think about that argument and where you lie on that. So these are the qualifications that the Texas Constitution clearly establishes to be a senator in the Texas Senate. Now let's move on to the Texas House. The Texas House of Representatives, commonly referred to as the Texas House, or right? Here's the qualifications. Again, established by the Texas Constitution. A U.S. citizen. Note, you only have to be a resident of Texas for 2 years. 12 months, still a year, as a resident of that district that you want to run in. At least 21 years of age. And the terms is for 2 years. You serve for 2 years. And again, there are no term limits. So again, this idea that you get to run, right, and keep getting reelected over and over and over again. I'm digressing. What's interesting to note real quick is the annual salary for our legislators. They earn about $7,200. Let me say it again. The annual salary is $7,200. Now, they do get a per diem. Okay, so that's the base pay, right? And they do get a per diem of $190 for every day that they are in session. So if you do the math, they get paid more. Substantially more than $7,200, but their annual base pay is about $600 a month. Which, again, since they only meet every 2 years, they get paid so little. This kind of explains why they have, think of a job that will allow you to take off for 140 days every 2 years, and that's assuming that the governor doesn't call you in for a special session. So jobs that come to my mind are lawyers, doctors, people with their own businesses. And this is one of the reasons why we keep seeing over and over and over people who serve in the Texas legislature have a similar background. Because their jobs allow them to be able to take off 140 days every 2 years, and potentially even longer if they're called back for a special session. I'm digressing. So we can move into what's known as informal qualifications, right? So what we previously have seen are requirements clearly established by the Texas Constitution, and it is explicitly written that these are the legal requirements you must have. But when we talk about informal qualifications, this isn't written. These are qualifications that are not written down anywhere. Okay, these are just kind of like what we what we hope for, what we think of, what we see, specifically for political scientists looking at previous leaders, previous elected members of the Texas legislature, we know some patterns here, right? We, as a public, we liked a member of the Texas legislature to have charisma, right? Or for any position in government, really. We like them to have some type of charisma, right? We also like to see them have an education, right? I mean, if you're going to represent a people, you should be able to convey that you care in a way that compels you and I to vote, and they need to be educated. To what degree? I mean, that's up to you and I. Should they have a PhD in public administration or political science? Does a particular degree matter? Should they have a master's, a bachelor's, associate's? Right? But just some level of education. We also like our candidates to have experience. But that's kind of, experience is interesting. And let me explain. How can you gain experience if you don't have experience, right? So it's an uphill battle. If we like to see people with experience, which helps explain why we keep re-electing incumbents as much as we do, then when someone new comes around, what experience do they have, right? But nevertheless, we like to see experience. And lastly, we like to see candidates that have communication skills, who can effectively communicate with people, right? So President Reagan, we saw him just a moment ago. He had charisma. He was able to, win debates, not only with his talking points, but with how he delivered his message. Former President Obama here, he had good communication skills. He was able to communicate his points effectively, and he was able to articulate what he wanted to do, right? If there is another point, well, actually, let me back up. Let me ask you, what are some informal qualifications that you possess? What are some informal qualifications that you want to see your candidates have? So a question I like to ask is, if you had the Infinity Gauntlet, right, for Marvel, and you could snap your fingers and create the perfect candidate, what characteristics, what qualifications would they have in them? What would you instill into them, right? Well, let me tell you one of mine. I like my candidates to be articulate. That's right, to be articulate. If they can effectively articulate a position, if they can tell me what they think, how they think, and what they would do in government if elected, and they can do that articulately, that's what I like to see. But I'm digressing. Let me know what you think. What qualifications would you have? Let me know. All right, so let's move on here. So, political representation. When we talk about the Texas legislature, when we talk about any legislature for that matter, we need to talk about representation, okay? So, political scientist Hannah Picton, she came up with, in her 1967 work, the concept of representation. She identifies 3 types of representation: descriptive, substantive, and symbolic representation. And descriptive representation is the composition, is referring to the composition of the legislative body. In other words, does the legislature represent the electorate demographically? To put that in simpler terms, does the legislature look like you and I? Does the elected representative look like the majority within that district? That's what we're talking about when we say descriptive representation. Do they match demographically, right? In terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of gender. Does that representative match the district? So does my representative And you can ask this question as well. Does the representative look like you? Does it look like me? Right? So that's descriptive representation. Substantive representation is the representation of a group interest within the policy making process. So there is a debate within political science about the linkage between descriptive representation and substantive representation. Again, substantive representation just simply means, do we see policy outcomes that match the group, that match the demographics of said district? Okay, so there's a debate within political science that this link between descriptive representation leads to substantive representation. Some argue that there's a strong link, others argue that the link is not as strong as we think it is. So in other words, if we have members who look like the district, right, then we should see policy outcomes that match demographically with that district. That's the argument. Okay. And then lastly, what we have is symbolic representation, which emphasizes that representation is a symbol that generates emotional responses among constituents. So, the very first female vice president, Kamala Harris, when she was inaugurated as VP, there were a lot of people, specifically women, specifically younger women, who looked at that and said, wow, that's me. It's an emotional response. For the first time in American history, we elected whether we agree with it, whether we agree with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris or not, put that political argument to the side just for a second here and just acknowledge that this is the first time we've seen a woman at this level of government. And for some, that is substantial. It is that emotional response. So these are the three types of representation that we see within the political science literature. That said, let's continue on. So, passing legislation. How does this work? I'm glad you asked. So let's dive into this, right? So step one is we see an introduction, that is to say, a bill. A bill is a piece of legislation, right? It's a piece of legislation. So a member of the Texas Legislature can introduce a bill only to their respective chamber, which makes sense, right? A Texas senator cannot submit or introduce a bill to the Texas House. That doesn't happen. That can't happen. So a Texas House member submits a bill, introduces a bill to the Texas House. A Texas senator can only introduce a bill to the Texas Senate. Okay, so that's step one, or part of step one. These bills must be introduced within the first 60 days of the regular session. Now, again, they only meet for 140 days. In the first 60 days, they have to write all the bills and introduce them to the respective chambers, right? After the first 60 days, the introduction of the bill requires a 4/5 vote from each chamber unless the governor has declared an emergency and the bill pertains to that emergency. Okay, so that's step one, just introducing the bill. Let's move on. Or step one continued. The bill will be assigned a specific number, such as, if it originated from the House, it's called HB. So if it's the very first bill introduced, it will be HB 1, House Bill 1. If it originated from the Texas Senate, it will be SB 1 or SB, whatever the number of that, whatever. So the number indicates when it was submitted. So if it's SB 1, it was the very first bill. If it's SB 2, it was the second bill, etc. Okay. So if the bill requires increase in taxes, so in other words, if the piece of legislation requires increase in taxes or raising funds, it must originate in the Texas House, not the Texas Senate. If it requires increase in taxes or raising funds, it must originate from the Texas House. So if a member of the Texas Senate has an idea, they can reach out to a colleague in the Texas House to try to get to try to author that bill. But just to be clear, if it has to do with increasing taxes or raising funds, it must originate from the Texas House. Okay. Once the bill is introduced, a caption, that is a short description of the bill, is read aloud. This is known as the first reading. And the presiding officer assigns the bill to a committee. So remember the two presiding officers. Which one is it again for the Texas House? Yes, that's right, the Texas Speaker of the House. And the presiding officer for the Senate is the, yes, exactly, the Texas Lieutenant Governor. So they have the power to assign a bill to the committee. Now, let's think about this through for a second. Let's say the House members have introduced a bill that the Texas Speaker of the House does not like, for whatever reason. It could be political, it could be non-political, just any reason the Texas Speaker of the House just doesn't like the bill. He can literally send it to a committee to die. Likewise, Lieutenant Governor, same thing. Maybe he doesn't like what this Texas Senate is doing. He could literally send that bill to a committee that is designed to kill bills. Right? So, it's interesting to note how this can play out, how this can work. And this is the reason why, I've said it before and I'll say it again, in Texas politics, the two most powerful political figures in Texas politics, Lieutenant Governor and the Texas Speaker of the House. So this is step one. Let's move on to step two. So committee work or committee action. This is where the committee will hear testimony for or against the bill. So let's say we have a bill that introduces Holocaust and genocide education required for every level of schooling, hypothetically speaking, right? So you would have experts from higher education, from public schools. You would have administration coming in. You would have other people from the public coming in to testify, to give testimony about the importance. What would this mean? What would this indicate? What kind of how would this help students? How would this help us politically, etc., etc. I want to say help us politically. What I mean to say is there a potential link? And research can show this or not. Is there a particular link between our level of Holocaust education and political polarization? Can it help us to become more civil, in other words? Testimony would be hard, right? That's what I'm trying to get at here. It would decide to take no action or issue what's known as a report on the bill. So if the committee takes no action, the bill dies. It's dead in committee. If they decide to issue a report on the bill lives on for another day, right? Again, like I said, if no action is taken, the bill dies. It is sent to its death. The bill simply dies if no action is taken. So if it's a highly controversial bill, depends on how controversial, it may just simply end up in a committee that just does nothing to it. If that's the will of the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor. The committee's report will introduce a record of how everyone voted and the recommendations regarding the bill. In other words, does any changes need to be made? Did all the members say, yeah, this is a great idea, but you need to change this one thing, and if you do that, we're good, right? Any recommendations that is attached to it and is sent out with the committee's report. Let's move on to step 3. This is the floor action. So a copy of the committee's report is sent to all members of the Texas Legislature, the House and the Senate. And the bill is read again by caption and then debated by the legislators. Members of the chamber will cast their votes. It's either a voice or a record vote. They have a mechanism in the Texas Legislature to record the votes. Basically it's a push to vote type situation. It's an electronic voting system that they have, or they can do it by voice. Aye, nay, etc. It does require for the floor action here. It does require a majority vote to pass the bill at the floor level. So assuming that majority votes yes to pass it, it survives. If it does not receive that vote, it dies. Once it passes, it is sent to the other chamber to vote on. So it kind of goes through this process yet again. This is a very lengthy process that has the potential of any bill dying very quickly because it's easier to do, if you will. I'm digressing. Let's move on to step 4. So step 4 is hammering out the differences. Okay, hammering out the differences. So hypothetically speaking, let's say that the Senate and the House the Texas House and the Texas Senate came up with the same. They dealt with the same issue, but they did it differently, right? They came up to it with it in a completely different way. Well, then what has to happen is what's known as a conference committee. A conference committee is put together from members of both the House and the Senate to come together to hammer out the differences between the two bills to come up with one bill that both chambers can agree on. Right? That's what we're talking about with these hammering up differences. So it's necessary when there are two different versions of the same bill, made up of, again, 5 members from each chamber. So we have 5 members of the Texas House, 5 members of the Texas Senate, 10 members total on this committee, hammering out these differences, coming up with a compromise that both chambers will agree on. Right, so 3 out of the 5 members from each chamber must approve in order to pass the bill, in order for it to survive the conference committee and be sent back out. If it passes, the bill is signed by the presiding officers, Texas Lieutenant Governor and the Texas Speaker of the House of each chamber, and then it is sent to the governor. Then it's sent to the governor. Okay, and here at the governor, the Texas governor has 4 options when a bill is passed by the Texas Legislature. They have 4 options. The first is to sign the bill into law. Done. It's just that simple. Texas Legislature did its work. The governor approves of that work, simply signs it, and it's done. Okay. Option 2, just simply ignore it. Let me say that again. Simply ignore it. They just don't sign it at all. But what happens? Well, if the Texas Legislature is in session, the bill becomes law within 10 days, regardless of the governor signed it or not. Okay, it becomes law anyways. But if the Texas Legislature is not in session, it becomes law within 20 days. So that's for not signing it. Option 3, the governor can simply veto it. Texas Legislature, I appreciate your work on behalf of all Texans, but I do not agree with what you're trying to do. I do not agree with this particular piece of legislation. I am simply going to say no and veto it. Now, if this happens, there is recourse. the Texas legislature can go, but we worked so hard on that, and everyone in our districts want this to happen, so we're going to override your veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers. If that happens, then it overrides that veto from the governor. Now, you may recall from Unit 1, our political culture. We have been dominated by political parties. For well over 100 years, it was a Democrat. Here, in the last, 30, 40 years, it's been the Republicans. More than likely, we're not going to see a governor veto because it's the same political power in the governor mansion as it is the same political power, same political party within the Texas legislature. So we're not going to see veto much. It's going to be extremely rare, but this is still a power that they have, that the governor has. Now, the governor does have the power to use what's known as a line item veto. Now, line item veto, this allows the governor to eliminate certain parts of a bill without killing the entire document. In other words, they can strike out portions of a bill and still strike out certain portions. Those portions are ripped out, but the rest of it is signed into law. He can do that. But it should be noted that this line item veto can only be used. Let me say this very slowly here. It can only be used if the bill is pertaining to the state's budget. If it's a state budget bill. That's the only time that the governor can execute this line item veto. So, with that said, we've looked at we've looked at the Texas legislature. We've taken a look at some of those qualifications. I'm still curious, what are your thoughts about informal qualifications? If you could snap your fingers and create a perfect candidate, what characteristics would they possess? We took a look at those three distinct types of representation: substantive, descriptive, substantive, and symbolic. We've taken a look at how bills are passed, how easily they can die, especially in committee. We've taken a look at, and indirectly, we've taken a look at the power that the Texas Speaker of the House and the Texas Lieutenant Governor have. And now we've taken a look at the options that the governor has regarding laws that are sent to his desk. So, if you have, so this concludes the lecture here. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to contact me at any time. Until next time, peace.